She dedicated 40 silent years to teaching without asking for praise, but one unexpected letter from a former student, now a billionaire, left everyone stunned. This tribute will move you deeply. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked pavement of Roosevelt Elementary as Miss Clara Henderson unlocked the rusted gates with hands that trembled slightly from arthritis. At 69, her silver hair was pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn for 4 decades, and her faded blue dress bore the careful mends of someone who understood the value of preservation. The school building loomed before her like a forgotten monument, its brick facade stained with years of neglect, windows clouded with dust and indifference. She paused, clutching her worn leather satchel against her chest, watching the empty playground, where broken swings hung motionless in the Chicago morning air. This was her kingdom, a realm of peeling paint and broken dreams that she had faithfully served without missing a single day. The hallways echoed with her solitary footsteps as she made her way to classroom 2B, the same room where she had taught. 3 generations of children. Her classroom was a study in perseverance desk graffiti that told stories of forgotten names, blinds that hung at awkward angles like broken wings, and a chalkboard that released clouds of dust with each stroke of her worn chalk. 23 desks arranged in neat rows faced forward, though she knew only 10 would be filled today, the usual attendance in a school that the district had quietly given up on. She placed her thermos of homemade tea on the desk, the same cracked vessel that had been her companion through countless lonely lunches, and began writing the day's lesson in her careful script. The students filed in with the energy of restless spirits, their eyes glued to phones they weren't supposed to have, their conversations filled with the casual cruelty that children wielded like weapons. Marcus Thompson, a boy with hollow eyes and bruises that he tried to hide beneath his oversized hoodie, slumped into the back row. Sarah Martinez clutched her stomach, quietly having skipped breakfast again because there was no food at home. James Wilson, the class comedian, prepared his daily arsenal of jokes at Miss Clara's expense, his laughter masking a desperation to be noticed. They barely acknowledged her presence as she began the lesson, her voice steady and patient despite the paper airplane that sailed past her head and the whispered insults that cut deeper than they should have. The other teachers gathered in the lounge, their laughter creating a barrier that Miss Clara had never been invited to cross. They spoke of weekend plans and upcoming vacations, while she sat alone in the corner sipping tea from her cracked thermos and grading papers with the dedication of a monk copying scriptures. Mrs. Patterson, fresh out of college, with her bright scarves and innovative teaching methods, dominated the conversation with tales of her interactive lessons and student engagement strategies. Mr. Rodriguez, the young social studies teacher, regaled them with stories of his students' achievements and their gratitude. None of them noticed when Miss Clara quietly left to return to her classroom, where she would spend her lunch period tutoring students who needed extra help, students whose names she had memorized, along with their fears, their hungers, and their hidden potential. But would anyone discover the secret that would change everything? Principal Davidson, a man 20 years her junior with an MBA and a 5-year plan to modernize the school, cornered her after classes on a Tuesday that felt heavier than most. His arms were folded across his chest in the universal posture of authority about to be exercised, and his expression carried the weight of decisions already made in meetings she hadn't been invited to attend. "We've been reviewing the staff roster. Miss Henderson," he said, his voice carrying the bureaucratic distance of someone who had never stood before a classroom of hungry children. "You're approaching 70, aren't you?" When she quietly corrected him, 69, he waved the distinction away like an insignificant detail. The words that followed landed like physical blows, outdated methods, lack of connection with modern students, the need for fresh perspectives and innovative approaches. She tried to defend herself, speaking of the children she knew by name, the ones who came to school hungry, the ones hiding bruises, the ones who couldn't read but were too ashamed to ask for help. His eye roll dismissed 40 years of dedication. In a single gesture and his final words, "The kids need role models, not relics," followed her home like a curse she couldn't shake. The walk to her small apartment felt longer that evening, each step carrying the weight of a career that seemed to be dissolving like chalk dust in rain. Her building stood in a neighborhood that time and progress had forgotten were streetlights, flickered unreliably, and hope seemed as scarce as the resources she fought for daily. Her one-bedroom apartment was a sanctuary of simplicity, shelves lined with books she'd collected over the years, a small kitchen where she prepared modest meals, and a window that faced east, so she could watch the sunrise each morning before heading to school. She fed Whiskers, the stray tabby, who had claimed her fire escape as home, and sat in her worn armchair staring at the city lights that twinkled like distant promises. Retirement loomed like a spectre, not the golden years others anticipated, but a surrender to irrelevance that felt like a slow death. What mysterious event would soon shatter the quiet desperation of her final years? The next morning brought another day of small humiliations and quiet victories, the delicate balance that had defined her career. Marcus threw a pencil at her back, while she wrote fractions on the board, his voice carrying the mocking question that had become her unofficial title, "You ever gonna retire, dinosaur?" The laughter that followed was sharp and familiar, but something about this particular moment cut deeper than usual, perhaps because she was beginning to wonder if they were right. She picked up the pencil with steady hands, placed it gently on her desk, and continued the lesson on division, as if the interruption had been nothing more than a bird flying past the window. But when the final bell rang and the students scattered, like leaves in autumn wind, she sat alone in her classroom feeling older than her years and more invisible than she had ever imagined possible. It was then that she noticed something unusual. Her desk drawer, which she always kept precisely closed, stood slightly ajar like a mouth preparing to speak a secret that would change everything. Inside the drawer lay a white envelope, crisp and clean against the chaos of her daily supplies, addressed simply to Miss Clara in handwriting she didn't recognize. Her arthritic fingers trembled as she opened it, expecting another student prank or administrative notice, but the words that greeted. Her eyes made the world shift on its axis. "Dear Miss Clara, you probably don't remember me, but I remember everything." The letter continued in typed precision, each sentence unlocking memories she had stored in her heart, like treasures. A quiet boy with hollow eyes who sat in the back row, who flinched when spoken to, who disappeared one day without explanation or goodbye. The signature at the bottom, Robert Mitchell, struck her like lightning, bringing back the image of a child she had worried about long after he vanished from her classroom. The second note, handwritten in careful script, invited her to the Grand Hall downtown on Friday evening, promising to honor her story and share it with the world. She read both letters 3 times, her hands shaking with disbelief, before carefully folding them and placing them in her purse like sacred documents. Friday arrived with the weight of anticipation and the lightness of impossible dreams. But Miss Clara remained in her classroom, convinced that the letters were either a mistake or a cruel joke designed to humiliate her further. She had learned not to trust in fairy tales or happy endings, having witnessed too many disappointments in her 69 years, to believe that someone like her could be the center of anything important. At 5 o'clock, as she packed her bag with the methodical precision of ritual, the school receptionist burst into her classroom with eyes wide and breathless excitement. "There's a man outside," she gasped, her words tumbling over each other like children rushing to recess. "With cameras and cars, he's asking for you." Miss Clara's heart began to race as she followed the receptionist through the empty hallways, her footsteps echoing like a countdown to something she couldn't comprehend. Have you ever experienced or known someone who experienced being forgotten, and then suddenly remembered in the most unexpected way? Share your thoughts in the comments. When she stepped through the school's front doors, reality rearranged itself like pieces of a puzzle falling into perfect alignment. Luxury cars lined the sidewalk like a parade of possibilities, their polished surfaces reflecting the late afternoon sun. A red carpet stretched from the school gate to the street, flanked by reporters with cameras and microphones, students and teachers who had gathered in curious clusters, and in the center of it all stood a man she barely recognized, but somehow knew instantly. Robert Mitchell had grown from a frightened boy into someone who commanded attention and respect. His tailored suit, speaking of success beyond her wildest imagination. Yet when their eyes met across the crowd, she saw the same vulnerable child who had once sat in her classroom, hungry and afraid. He walked toward her with tears streaming down his face, the powerful businessman dissolving into the boy, who had needed her kindness more than food or shelter. Without hesitation, he dropped to one knee and took her weathered hands in his own, his voice breaking as he spoke the words that would echo in her heart forever. "You saved my life, now it's my turn." The makeshift stage appeared like magic, surrounded by faces she recognized, and many she didn't, all focused on the woman who had spent 40 years believing she was invisible. Robert's voice carried across the crowd as he spoke into the microphone, his words painting a picture of influence that she had never imagined possessing. "Everyone celebrates CEOs, innovators, founders," he said, his voice steady, despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "But today I celebrate the woman who taught me how to spell my name." He told their story, how she had noticed a quiet boy when no one else did, how she had fed him when he was hungry, how she had believed in him when his own parents couldn't see past their own struggles. The crowd listened in respectful silence as he revealed the depth of her impact, the way her patience and dignity had planted seeds that had grown into forests of possibility. Then came the announcement that made the world gasp. "Today, we rename this place the Clara Hart Academy." The document he pulled from his jacket was more than paper and ink. It was validation, recognition, and security wrapped in legal language that spoke of $5 million designated for scholarships, teacher support, and a home where she would never be alone again. Miss Clara covered her face with hands that had graded countless papers and wiped away countless tears, overwhelmed by the magnitude of generosity that had emerged from seeds she had planted in silence. The same students who had once mocked her now stood in reverent awe, beginning to understand that greatness doesn't always announce itself with fanfare, but sometimes works quietly in forgotten corners, shaping lives with patience and love. When she finally found her voice, it cracked with emotion as she spoke the words that would become legend. "I taught in silence for 40 years, never expecting anything. But today I realize that the seeds we plant in quiet sometimes bloom in ways we could never imagine." As Robert embraced her whispering words of gratitude that could never fully capture the depth of his appreciation, Miss Clara felt the weight of 4 decades lift from her shoulders like fog dissipating in morning sun. The ceremony that followed was a celebration not just of her service, but of the quiet heroes who shape the world, one student at a time, one moment of kindness at a time, one lesson at a time. The local news carried her story that evening, and within days letters began arriving from former students across the country, doctors, teachers, parents, and dreamers who had been touched by her patient dedication. The Clara Hart Academy became more than a renamed school. It became a symbol of hope in forgotten places, a reminder that every child deserves someone who believes in their potential, and every teacher deserves recognition for the sacred work they do in silence. The weeks that followed brought changes that Miss Clara had never dared to imagine: a beautiful apartment overlooking the lake, resources for her classroom that she had only dreamed of, and most importantly, a renewed sense of purpose that came from knowing her life's work had mattered more than she had ever believed possible. She continued teaching, but now with the support and recognition she had earned through 4 decades of faithful service. Students came to the Clara Hart Academy from across the district, drawn by the story of transformation and the promise that every child would be seen, valued, and nurtured. Miss Clara walked through hallways that bore plaques honoring her service, taught in classrooms equipped with the latest technology, and sat in a teacher's lounge where her colleagues sought her wisdom and experience. But the greatest change was in her heart, where the loneliness and invisibility of the past had been replaced by the knowledge that love, patience, and dignity, the gifts her mother had taught her to give, had indeed changed the world in ways both seen and unseen. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.